garbage, you flyboy!
This is a rebellion, isn't it?
I call it aggressive negotiations.
The garbage will do!
Welcome to this month's Trash Compactor podcast, Star Wars from the female perspective. I'm Emcee, and I'm here with
April
And smols.
So usually during this segment of the podcast, we talk about news in the Star Wars fandom, but I felt it was important that we actually talk about what I like to think of as anti-news. We get a lot of announcements from Lucasfilm about things that are going to be happening in the Star Wars universe, and there's lots of movies and books and everything, but that's not enough for the 24-hour news cycle where somebody always wants to have a clickbait article coming out. We're always getting bombarded with a friend of a friend of a friend of somebody who works at Lucasfilm said that they're not making any more spin-off movies, or somebody has found leaks for everything that is going to happen in Episode 9.
I just want to say that I've been saying for months and months, maybe even a year, I've been trying to remind people, the fandom in general on Tumblr, that there have been no official announcements of an Obi-Wan movie or a Boba Fett movie, because there's been so much speculation about them as if they are a done deal, and I won't be surprised if they do happen, but they have not been officially announced. And so people suddenly losing their minds that supposedly they've been put on hold is just such a bunch of horseshit. Basically, some big name podcasts that are supposedly news sources, they need to stop pretending they have behind the scenes news or insight and just look into writing real person fiction, since that's what their doing amounts to. This goes for the side of the the fanboy side of the fandom that is allergic to fic of any kind, so they make up shit theories because there's no sources, there's no textual support. But they'd be great fics if they could get over their allergy to fics. This also goes for people on Tumblr who didn't like The Last Jedi and make up, and have been, even before it came out, these Lucasfilm conspiracy theory RPF about how Mark hates The Last Jedi and how Kelly is trying to seduce John.
Yeah, I actually think that a lot of the rumors about the movies being put on hold, that they're not doing any more spinoffs, a lot of that is coming from people who don't like Solo, and they want to be like, oh, Solo has killed off the Star Wars movies.
Which is hilarious because Solo is what a lot of people wanted or claimed to want. Not as sort of definitely a Solo movie, because not many people were like, hey, great about that. But I'm just saying, we've got your male lead, you've got your fucking all your cool OT fan service.
The podcast that I won't name, that is a really big name that started the whole Lucasfilm has put things on hold. It's not a story. Lucasfilm has never operated on the Marvel model. They don't announce things way ahead. They don't announce dates way ahead. Every article I've read has amounted to people being like, oh my gosh, and now Lucasfilm, unlike Marvel, hasn't set any dates. They never have. They've always said they don't.
Well, if I remember the article, it was a source close to Lucasfilm, which I thought was a really weird way to phrase it, because it's Lucasfilm is a ginormous company.
That was for the Hollywood Reporter, it seemed really sloppy. It's they wanted to get in and say something about this because they had to, but they didn't have sources either. Because was Lucas, and you would think that they would have somebody who could confirm or deny, but all we got from them was a source who knows how Lucasfilm thinks, as if Lucasfilm is a person.
They really disappointed me because, I had considered them legitimate entertainment news reporting rather than, just, these whoever site. One of the stupidest sentences I've ever read was a source that understands that knows Lucasfilm's thinking They haven't halted development, but they are licking their wounds.
That could legit be any fanboy.
Yeah, well, because it mentions, too, something about the reaction to The Last Jedi. I was like, the critical reaction was great, and I'm sure that they completely understand what the actual fan reaction was.
So after that, they're like, yeah, so The Last Jedi and Solo, lumping them together, they're extremely different fan reactions, critical reactions, so lumping them together is so stupid. And then, like, I was talking to another friend about this, and she was just like, what exactly is the licking of the wounds they're doing if they're just continuing to do what they've always done, which is not announce things way ahead of time?
That Hollywood Reporter article was online only, right?
I think so.
There's often vastly different editorial standards for online and print.
Okay, well, that's fair.
I just thought of that too. Still, the Hollywood Reporter, I thought, always had slightly better editorial standard.
That's why I made a post that says, my motto now, in order to like keep saying it, is that until it's officially announced by Lucasfilm, it's a lie. Yes, even rumors reported by credible news outlets, even from sources who have been right before, even rumors that I personally like and think make sense.
It's like with Lando being in 9.
I made this post after, like, seeing somebody being like, oh my gosh, it's so exciting, Lando's going to be in episode 9. There's no source. It's not just that, like, the people who write the pieces are being irresponsible. It's that the people that there's a lot of posting them on Tumblr without being like, this is a rumor. And then there's a lot of people just reading the headline and believing it.
Yeah. I've had people send me those posts and they're all excited and I'm just like, this is not confirmed. Like, and people have been like freaking out about Lando in a sequel trilogy movie forever. Like, this is one of those stories that keeps getting, and like, I think it makes sense for Lando to be in 9.
I do too.
It doesn't mean it's gonna happen.
Even I have, like, fallen victim to reading stuff and thinking that it might be, like, legit.
I've gotten better at it, but I've been sucked into.
Oh, I definitely have been. It's easy, but now, I don't know. That's why I'm, like, hyper vigilant.
What's like when the John Williams thing came out and was like, John Williams says that Rey's parents aren't actually nobodies. I was like, really? So I go to the source and they're like, in this interview he said, and it was some sort of paraphrase about what he said. So I'm like, I'm gonna listen to this fucking podcast that I don't really have a whole lot of interest in just to find out what he actually said. And turns out just his opinion and some conjecture, and him sort of vaguely agreeing with what the host said. My brain wanted to explode because I had to waste time.
One of the things I hate about this, I hate everything about it, but thing I hate about it is that, like, things like attitudes like this, like not checking for sources, or like if you post a thing that is a rumor and don't like say it's a rumor, if you have a big following, like you've like become part of a problem. I mean, maybe you don't know it yourself, maybe you're stupid, but if you don't, and if you're just like, oh, this is just a rumor, but you don't make it clear in your posting of that link, then you're responsible for things that eventually happen, like fans getting really excited about a rumor because everybody wants it and it would make sense, and it might make sense as a story direction, and thinking it's going to happen and feeling entitled to it, and then it doesn't happen and they throw a fit about something not happening that was never going to happen. I mean, this has happened multiple times.
It's really easy with movie announcements, with book announcements, with major casting announcements. If Lucasfilm has not made a post about it on their site, it's not true.
Yeah, honestly, I could hear a voice from heaven telling me something directly, and I would be like, no, are you Kathleen Kennedy? I don't believe you.
The rumor that's going around a lot lately that I've heard is that Kathleen Kennedy is like 2 steps away from getting fired.
So laughable.
Which I think for a lot of people is just, they want to wish really hard.
Yeah, it's definitely wishful thinking. Like, I saw people talk about it like it's just like this inevitable thing, and I'm like, okay, like she brought in $3 billion plus grossing movies in a row.
And she has a solid history from before.
Maybe Solo did not meet expectations, but that's not going to cause them to shit can her.
If she were to exit at this point, I think it would be for a better offer somewhere else.
Yeah, it would not be a personal defeat.
No.
Yeah, I think basically fandom just needs to get some chill. They need to get chill for a lot of different things, but for this in particular.
This is like a simple thing to just be like, is it an official announcement? Well then.
Out of all of the things that fandom can get chill about, this is the one that I think is easily within our grasp. And that's look for actual sources, and if it's a quote from somebody, if you like see a little snippet of a thing where it's like Mark Hamill doesn't like The Last Jedi, actually find the thing that apparently where Mark Hamill says something like that and watch it and find out exactly what's being said, because people take stuff out of context so much where something might be completely misconstrued because you're only taking like this tiny snippet of this big long conversation.
And don't trust print interviews, no matter where they come from. The few times I've even been interviewed for a print outlet for directing a play, especially like it depends on too, like how much the interviewer actually knows about the subject. I've said things and I'm like, wow, that's not really what I said, and I sound like an idiot. Like there was a case with Benedict Cumberbatch where he was made out to be kind of a centrist on a topic, and he was angry enough about it to dispute it, and they printed the transcript because of it. And it was like, yes, this was vastly different than what it was like reported that he said, you know? So like be wary of print interviews too, honestly, at this point.
Oh, definitely, because not only is it, you know, not having the knowledge on the subject, but it's also having a bias, because having a headline that says Mark Hamill hates The Last Jedi or John Williams says that Rey's parents are actually somebody is going to get a lot more clicks on it than Mark Hamill thought the storyline with Luke was interesting, or John Williams has an opinion but no actual insight into the writing process.
A point I want to make too is that, so like speculation for some fans is stressful and for some fans it's fun. But so if you have fun with these things and don't like actually believe them, but are like, oh, this like crazy leak gives me ideas or whatever, like please be clear about that. You have a responsibility, especially if you have a large amount of like followers. I think you have a responsibility to frame it as such. I think it's also courteous of everybody to like tag speculation, because it really stresses some of us out.
Especially as we head into filming. Like filming is the dark time.
When this podcast started, we actually did have a news segment. One of the reasons we got rid of that, aside from it taking a lot of research to actually source everything, is that everything was coming out in these little bites so that we couldn't really delve into a topic, and it was hard to source everything, so a lot of stuff ended up being rumors and speculation. So it just kind of became, you know, we're going to talk about the shit that Lucasfilm has like officially announced, and that's kind of it.
And it's not like there's a lack of it. I mean, there is if you stick to just movies, but they are like constantly producing EU content.
Star Wars Resistance coming this fall.
Haha! Yeah, we were not paid. We are not paid by Lucasfilm to promote things.
But you can. If Lucasfilm wants to pay us, then, you know, I will totally accept that, because I don't make subs forever.
Lucasfilm, accept my in-universe poetry manuscript.
Just let me go to the premiere next year. That's all I want.
So, on that note, fandom, get some chill.
Be responsible.
Be
Take a
responsible,
step back.
yes. Take a breath.
Don't badmouth other people's critical thinking skills if you're being bad about critical thinking yourself.
Yeah. On that note, we'll get into this month's roundtable discussion. We will be discussing some of the new EU books that have come out. Welcome to this month's Trash Compactor Podcast Roundtable. Today we're talking about more of the novels that make up the current expanded universe. I'm Emcee, and I'm here with
April.
Smols.
So there are so many books in the new canon that this is, I'd say, the fourth one that we've actually done talking about books, and this still is not all of them. We actually had to pick and choose which ones we were going to talk about, because otherwise podcast would be way too long, and also we all need to read the books to get ready to do this stuff, and it's like there's too many. So we've picked 4 of them to talk about this month. The first one we'll talk about is the first one, I believe, that came out in this group of books, and that's Ahsoka by E.K. Johnson. So, you know, if the title doesn't give it away, it's about Ahsoka Tano. Specifically, it's about Ahsoka after Order 66 and is basically how she gets from Order 66 to where we see her in Rebels as Fulcrum. Kind of just the very short version of things, but there's a lot more to talk about. I love this book just because I really love Ahsoka. I mean, I gotta be honest. Like, I mean, it is a good book, but it's like, it's Ahsoka, so
yeah.
I love
I found it interesting. Back when I first read it, I recommended it to a friend who has never watched Star Wars, who at the time hadn't watched the Star Wars, the Clone Wars series, or Star Wars Rebels. But I mean, she knew who Ahsoka was just because, word of mouth. And she still enjoyed it, like, a lot, having none of that detailed context.
Yeah, I mean, that's where I was, too, because I sort of started watching Clone Wars, and I didn't really get into it, and I haven't seen Rebels, but I knew a little bit about Ahsoka, and I loved it. I was just like, this is an amazing character.
And we've talked about Ahsoka before on the Rebels podcast. She is such a great character, and there was such a gap between where we saw her in Clone Wars and where we see her in Rebels. We absolutely needed this book to know how all of that went down. How did she survive Order 66? Because that basically killed off everybody. She's not identifying as a Jedi now.
I thought it was neat because in the actual plot of the story takes place in not a very long amount of time, but there are like interludes that are like flashbacks, or even though we don't like check in with her every year, from Rada to Rebels, it establishes, what we need to know.
We also get some really good mythology in terms of the Jedi and in particular lightsabers, because we find out about the purification of kyber crystals, which I live for. And we also get introduced to some really neat new characters, which is something I love about most of the new books, is that they will introduce book-only characters that you just love. And in particular, this one had some really good ones that, it's like, yay, I have an Ahsoka show.
Yeah. I love Kaden. I love Kaden so much. Kaden.
Yeah. It's a really fantastic character. She and her sister.
I know that since Ahsoka is not E.K. Johnston's character in the way that Kaden Lard is, Kaden was very clearly queer. Explicit that her friends can see she's attracted to Ahsoka, and she's the secondary protagonist of the novel, basically. So we get her point of view, and she thinks to herself about how she's attracted to Ahsoka, and she expresses that. Ahsoka is not Johnston's character, so she definitely had to like walk a fine line there.
Didn't she mention something about that?
Yeah, she did. I wish I could see. It was either on Tumblr or Twitter. Oh, she was just talking about some of her writing in general and writing romance, and she talked about how, like, the romance in Ahsoka was, like, a truncated romance.
Yeah, like, she said something like it was corporately mandated or something that was, like, she was sort of trying to say she would have made it more explicit if she could have.
Yeah, it was, like, I don't know if it was, like, a Disney or a Lucasfilm thing because it's a young adult novel, who knows, or if it's because they're, like, super cautious about their big, major characters.
I don't even know if it has to do with the fact that it is a queer romance, or if it's the fact that this is a Jedi character. And I know Ahsoka doesn't identify as a Jedi anymore, but she still kind of has that Jedi mentality to her. So Lucasfilm might have been like, we're not really sure we want to do this. And obviously they had a storyline for Ahsoka for Rebels. So it's like, do we really want to put in a romance with Ahsoka here and then have people expect us to explain it there?
True. Didn't Ahsoka come out after Rebels? I don't know, but I remember at some point we talked about this on Tumblr a little bit, April, is that I got an ask because I was like, woohoo, Ahsoka and, Dr. Aphra are both like women-loving women, canonically. It's really obvious, like you cannot argue that Dr. Aphra likes the ladies. I remember thinking as I read it that, like, clearly Ahsoka has feelings for Kaden, even if she can't, like, articulate them to herself because of her background. Like, just from the structure of the novel, as I was in the middle of reading it, I was like, this is a YA novel, and Kaden is in the like written in the love interest role, you know, like she's the person she's the person that like Ahsoka like drops everything for, like, you know, she goes and rescues her multiple times, and like if Ahsoka were like a dude and still left these feelings unspoken, there would be no question. To me, nobody would question the fact Kaden is her love interest, even if it's not like said. And that's my frustration sometimes, because to me, the text of the story shows me that Ahsoka is queer. Nobody has said she isn't. So to me, I'm like, that's canon. And that's true of a few other characters in Star Wars canon too, where I'm frustrated both on the end that, like, on the one hand that they're not ready yet to be like more explicit than they are, but on the other hand, I'm frustrated with fans who are obsessed with canon but like have to say it or they have to kiss.
Part of the problem is that it's the reaction to it and the underlying homophobia of fandom in general, which I know sounds really weird considering how fucking queer a lot of fandom is. But the whole idea that you can't have a character interested in someone of the same gender, and it absolutely has to be explicit for people to accept it. Because in this, yes, it was very much written as a romance, and if it had been an opposite gender relationship, everybody would have said, okay, this is the love interest and they're definitely in a romance. But because they're two women, people are like, well, I need Lucasfilm to tell us like straight out that they're together.
If you think of the wider audience who aren't going to pick up on that kind of thing, I think that in a way we've talked about a lot as far as making characters explicitly non-white. There are certain people, because they default to everybody being white, you know, you can have a character like Rue in the Hunger Games who, you know, to a lot of people very clearly was meant to be a black girl, and then have people just surprised that she was in the movie. Because you have a general audience that is not going to pick up on this and just think that Kaden and Ahsoka are just really, really good friends, that it's wanting to just, you know, acknowledge that more, so that because it also helps train the general audience, I think, more on picking up on it if things are more explicit. Totally understand all the other frustrations, but I think that might have a lot to do with, yeah.
The frustration is coming from multiple angles for me.
Yeah. Until we get people who are, you know, might not be queer themselves, who can very explicitly see something and be like, oh yeah, I think they are girlfriends. You know, maybe we do have to be louder about it, but then, you know, you have the angle of, could she have been? I don't, from what she's implied, I don't think she was able to do more than she did. So the fact that she made it so clear in subtext actually was cool, that she was able to get away with what she did.
It's like June right now as we're recording this, which is Pride Month. So I guess this is appropriate for us to talk about, because it's really interesting. Like, Chuck Wendig was able to, like, he got so much criticism from homophobic, like, fanboys for having a gay main character in Aftermath in Sinjir, and just, like, being, like, casually scattering, like, queer people everywhere.
Yeah, and Chuck don't give a fuck, so...
And then, of course, there's Dr. Aphra in the comics. The longer she's around, the, like, more and more, like, explicitly, like, lesbian she is. But those are, like, original, like, film, not non-television characters.
Yeah, they could do what they wanted with them.
I guess the uproar over, like, Lando recently with John Kasdan is just another example.
In hindsight, I wonder if he wishes he hadn't just made it more explicit, since the movie didn't do well anyway.
I can't remember if we talked about this when we talked about Solo. Solo was kind of like Ahsoka to me, and to me it showed a lot of queerness without being explicit, but I definitely, like, knew that a lot of general audience people wouldn't view it that way. It's both understandable and frustrating. Just as, like, on the fandom side, it's both understandable and frustrating that there's this tendency to call, like, anything queerbaiting that isn't people kissing. Like, sometimes I'm like, no, that's not queerbaiting. It's just queer context. And then to take things that, like, aren't queer context, subtext, and insist that they are, like, I don't know. Like, why don't you do the opposite?
I have never experienced that ever, and that's all I'm going to say about that. Off the topic of the queer relationship in Ahsoka, one of the things that I really liked about this book is that it was another instance of the expanded universe showing us just how evil and spreading the Empire was, mining these planets and just destroying them for their own gain.
The agricultural devastation.
I read it either in between Aftermath books or very soon after. I don't remember when I read this book at all. But I remember thinking, because along with talking about what happened with Kashyyyk, and then, was it Aftermath or this novel that talked about what happened with Ilium?
It was this novel.
Yeah, so it talked about Ilium, and then with Rada, like, just this complete sucking, blatant too. Like, it's just this sort of, and it gets in, and then we can talk about the same thing with Cobalt Squadron, because it's just like total disregard for the inhabitants of these planets.
Which, of course, was also a running plot in Rebels with Lothal. So this is something that they've really pushed, I think, more in the new expanded universe than they ever did with Legends. I mean, they touched on it, but certainly here, it's not just that, oh, the Emperor is evil and is controlling people. It's like, no, the Empire is absolutely devastating the galaxy.
Which makes me, like, especially because we see stuff, the First Order following that lead. To me now, despite whatever, shorthand imagery they're using for the Empire and the First Order, like, it seems very clear to me that, like, a closer parallel that you can draw would be English imperialism and then later American imperialism, because, it's sort of the template for American imperialism was English imperialism, as much as we would like to deny that. So, like, yeah, I think that is a much closer, especially if we're looking at through a modern lens, it's a much closer parallel than saying they're all Nazis.
A lot of this reminds me of what they did, and I know this is controversial to bring up because people are not too keen on it anymore. It reminds me of what they did with Firefly, where they had, like, these core worlds which were very rich in everything, and then on the outer worlds everybody was suffering because, they didn't have enough resources, and the resources that they did have were being taken by the core worlds because they need everything. And this is something that obviously comes up a lot. Like, you mentioned the Hunger Games before, April, and it's something that comes up in that. So I do think that it's something that's really important for them to cover. Then it's not just, the Empire is, this vague, evil group of people that destroy planets with big lasers. They
slowly suck them dry with no regard for who lives on them.
I remember reading, like, one of the first waves of, like, new canon novels, and it became this pattern. Like, they were all unique, but it was like, oh, we're going to, like, ruin the soil. We're just going to, like, try to explode this moon to get this component. In every single one there was something like that, and it really, like, drove it home for me.
If you think about it in terms of, like, what North America looked like as far as the resources in North America, and just, think about how big a galaxy is. What is a planet in a galaxy? So, like, what is one forest in Montana? Doesn't matter who's living, it's like, they don't think about that. Like, it's like you see a forest and you see the money and the resources, and you don't see the people that have been living there and that use the forest as their home and not, for timber or whatever. I think it's sort of that same idea too. It's like, oh, we've got plenty of resources. We've got this whole galaxy, just like we have, like, entire continents. But I also shows, like, how quickly, because if you look at how quickly we have managed to devastate our own planet, it's like, how quickly can you bleed a galaxy dry of the resources?
These planets would probably be in a lot better shape if they weren't all single biomes.
True.
Well.
Except for the core worlds don't tend to be single biome, right? They're all more Earth-like.
Well, I mean, the core is Coruscant, so...
On the movies on screen, they are single biomes. Sometimes in the comics and the books, they talk about different geological stuff. But, yeah, they're functionally single biome for the most part. Something I had forgotten from this, that, like, in such an early novel, Ahsoka thinks about how the Clone Wars really helped to put in the framework of the Empire, because they were going to so many planets to try to, like, help them and like building an infrastructure for insurgency against the separatists, and that made it easier, because the Republic was there, and then the Republic turned into the Empire. And so I had forgotten, but she thinks about how she's like, wow, I helped put this in place.
Palpatine is really just so fucking devious, because seriously, he did like an entire galactic war where he was the head of both sides so that he could put all of this into place.
It's so sad to think, because the systemic environmental deliberate mining and leaching of planets by the Empire follows on the heels of a war that, devastating. Having battles above your planet can damage things. It's so understandable how tired people are of war. Because the Clone Wars were terrible, and they were the first, major galaxy-wide conflict in, hundreds of thousands of years, maybe.
Yeah, they've gotten kind of vague on exactly what the war situation was before the Clone Wars, because I know they had developed things in Legends, but I don't know how much they've kept that. Personally, I keep it. My opinion is always anything that takes place before the Clone Wars, I keep as canon until they tell me otherwise.
It's such a rich period to mine too. I'm sure that they have plans maybe to do so at some point.
There was that, this, Emcee, obviously you didn't miss that Jedi Mandalorian conflict references in Rebels.
Oh, yeah.
But it seems by the time of the Clone Wars, or even the invasion of Naboo, is that everybody has gotten really complacent.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, that's how they explain how fabulous Padme looks, because it's a period of bountiful richness in the galaxy, so everybody's dressed super fancy, as opposed to what Leia wears, where it's very utilitarian.
The other thing in Ahsoka, she thinks about what happened with Kashyyyk, and they really went in on Kashyyyk early, because this is just a year or two after Return of the Sith. This is another thing I'd forgotten until my reread, is that they're in one of these earlier novels. They really do not in a over the top way. They do really establish how especially human centric the Empire is, because at first she was surely people would be upset if they targeted a specific species, but then she's well, maybe not, because the Wookiees.
It was absolutely 100% explicit in Legends, and I think they have included that enough in the new expanded universe to call it.
I could probably list off the places where it's mentioned. I had just forgotten that it was in Ahsoka as well.
Yeah, it's talked a lot in Thrawn as well.
Yeah, it's great in there, the Thrawn, because it kind of talks about this kind of thing in a nuanced situation, because it's not like there are no non-humans in Imperial hierarchy, but there are very few, and they're tokens or whatever.
They have to be useful.
They have to be super useful, because there's Thrawn, and then the only Imperial, high up in the Imperial hierarchy characters I can think of is a Battlefront 2 character who was Iden Versio's
Isn't
teacher.
Palpatine's?
Oh, and Masa Meta, Thrawn, and I can't remember her name, but she's an Aqualish, I think. But anyway, it's very few and far between.
Has there been something recently, or is this something I imagined or read somewhere else, with somebody going in on how humans like to colonize?
That passage is from Rebel Rising, the young adult Jyn Erso novel.
Okay, so I did see it, somebody had posted it. It perfectly describes the English, and so if we're still, making that comparison, it really brought that home.
Conclusion about Ahsoka, we talked a lot about topical things, but, the characters in it are really, really good. There's a baby Leia Organa cameo. Yeah. R2 and Bail are in there. It's really insightful.
We got to see a little bit of Rex, my boy Rex.
The whole thing with the Inquisitorius, their role in finding Jedi, and the really terrifying aspect of them, Ahsoka nearly being abducted when she was young as a Force sensitive, which that really made me think about, Rey, and how fortunate it was for her that her powers didn't manifest until she was 19.
Read Ahsoka. We did a lot of like political discussion around it, but like the characters are really amazing.
Plot is really excellent too.
There's a lot of like Easter eggs that are well done.
This book leads really well into another book about a female main character, and this was one of the books, The Journey to the Last Jedi, Cobalt Squadron by Elizabeth Wen, and is about Rose Tico. I would say it's not just about Rose Tico, it's also just as much about Paige.
Yeah, it is about their, oh my gosh. So their relationship, set against the backdrop of what was the Resistance doing, or what were all these people doing pretty much during the events of The Force Awakens, kind of.
And it explains why like there were no, like the bombers weren't around in TFA.
All of that fanboy questioning of, well, where was Rose during all of this if it was just a couple of days ago?
They were doing other things. That's why they need to read and write more fan fiction, because then they wouldn't like freak out about like things like this. Be like, either somebody's thought of it or you can just imagine it yourself, bros. Come on.
That is essentially my job on the Return to the Hellmouth podcast, is taking stuff from 20 years ago, and when we find holes in it, I'm like, I'm gonna come up with a theory and fill it in. That's why I'm really bitter that I don't write these novels myself. So I'll just do it in fan fiction. Cobalt Squad is about the mission that Paige and Rose were on during The Force Awakens, and we actually do see the destruction of the Hosnian system from their point of view, and where they actually like feel it.
That was amazing. By the way, that was like something that they felt that reverbed so hardcore through the entire galaxy.
It was cosmic.
They talk about it. Obviously, in A New Hope, Obi-Wan gets all woozy about the destruction of Alderaan, but the destruction of the Hosnian system was just so intense that even non-Force sensitives were able to feel it. I really like that, because that shows that it's not just Jedis that feel the Force. The Force is all-encompassing.
Although I think that definitely makes sense to me. My mind more went to like the technical aspect of it, of Starkiller Base. I don't think they really contradict each other.
No, like it was to me, it was like the energy.
Rose mentions the Force and the shockwave that happened from Alderaan.
See, this is good. You guys read this more recently than
I listened to this as an audiobook, so I remember things, because I just remember Kelly Marie Tran read it, so I tend to remember a lot of things. And actually, I should mention that the Ahsoka novel was read by Ashley Eckstein. The Ahsoka book was read by Ahsoka, and Cobalt Squad was read by Rose Tico. So they're getting good people to do the audiobooks.
Yes, so I think with Cobalt Squadron, what I loved so much about that is not only it gives us more of an idea of what the Resistance was doing and some of the things that the direct actions that they were taking, and also of course gives us this beautiful insight into Paige and Rose's relationship. And then also just sort of how, because you have that moment where Rose decides somewhat selfishly that she wants to stay with Paige on the flight, and then the person that was in her place dies. I think that may have had something to do with her decision to separate from Paige for the next mission. And of course that leads to Paige dying and Rose not, because Rose was usually on the bomber with Paige. So that was all hard. I cried at the end, because I was just because you know what's coming. You're they've always seen each other again, and they're not. And we know from the Last Jedi novelization that Rose actually sees Paige's bomber go down.
Oh man, that was a really hard... I was driving home and listening to it at that end part, and I'm like, you can't cry, cry, you're driving your car.
To see Rose's, because Rose is still so interesting, because she is really prickly. And she's not always nice. At times,
she's super anxious all the time.
Yeah, and how she's with Reeve. And I think Reeve was one of those things where she was annoyed with him because he reminded her so much of herself that it was just oh, you suck. But it's really internal, But then he ends up inspiring her. But also seeing the relationship between Paige and Rose and how much they meant to each other, and the events what all they survived together, and then the events that led to them being separated when Paige dies. It really crystallizes too motivations for why Rose was so fucking angry at Finn at first. To me, in the movie, it was enough. It's yes, her sister is gone. We don't have to explain this, again, why, but it's it just really drove home, just what she lost and what that loss represents to her, and why she would just be you fucking asshole, you know? But it's funny because she had probably, you know, when you think about it, it's like up until a couple of days ago, she might have done the same thing that Finn was doing. She had motivations for being in the Resistance, so that were very clearly, like, more solid. Like, you know, Finn didn't have any loyalty to the Resistance. Rose doesn't know this, that Finn doesn't necessarily, isn't it with the cause yet. Yeah, I actually, now that I think about it, I'm like, no, I don't think Rose would have ever abandoned the Resistance after what they did to her system.
Well, she remembers her home world.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like in The Last Jedi, she's very freshly on it, is Paige's death. She remembers her homeworld and it being devastated. Like the Empire, the First Order has also been devastating worlds. Like, we don't think about it, and I think it's because there are, like, inhabited worlds in the unknown region where, you know, the First Order was building up. They're not very known to the galaxy, but there are planets there that they have taken over and subjugated, like the Empire did. It's not very visible to us.
It was also cool learning that Rose was the one who basically, she created the technology that they would have used for the transports to get them to Crate, and that would have safely gotten them to Crate had events not occurred the way they occurred.
Had Poe not been a jackass.
How dare you? I thought you loved him.
I do. That's why I'm allowed to say it.
I love him too.
It's cool. And also, like, the whole thing with the way that Paige and Rose were raised, sort of in this environment where they, you know, had plant life, but it was artificially maintained, and, like, Rose is such a brilliant technician. I'm just like, it makes me crave so much more for, you know, Rose and Rey to have, like, a conversation in 9, hopefully about plants or tech stuff.
It's really great because, like, on the surface, somebody can complain, oh, Rose is another mechanic, but they're so different. It's great. They're such different characters, even aside from, you know, force sensitive versus non-force sensitive.
I think one thing that really struck me when reading this book, so many people complained about Rose's character in The Last Jedi and not understanding why she was there and, you know, not understanding who she was. I think it's like, well, if you read this book, you find out exactly who Rose is. I mean, granted, I thought they explained it pretty well in the movie, but just aside from that, yeah, Star Wars is just such a multimedia event these days where it's like, yes, you do have the movie, but you have all of this other stuff, and you can enjoy, or at least I think you can enjoy the movie on its own. But if you're going to get into this much minutia where you're going to complain about the fact that they don't fully explain absolutely everything about a character, then you do have to go into this kind of stuff. And there's all of these very interesting books that they're coming out with that they came out with this before the movie did. And it's labeled on the front, The Journey to the Last Jedi. So they're basically saying, if you want to get a deeper enjoyment of The Last Jedi, read this book. Basically, fanboys, and I do say fanboys because I'm generalizing, but they need to just grow up and realize that Lucasfilm actually does know what they're talking about with this kind of stuff. They're telling a story.
Yeah, well, and also, I mean, how much more explicit can you get than my sister just died protecting this fleet, and the part about, you know, coming and taking all of their ore and then bombing them. These are her motivations, and they are not even oblique. It's text. Like, you know, it is 100% textual what her motivations are. Like, that's one thing, my thing about Rose is, like, Rose's motivations are the clearest, honestly, of, like, any character other than, I think, maybe Leia. So it's just like, what the fuck do they have to do? Maybe it's something else that people are objecting to with this character, because it surely can't be that they don't actually understand why she does what she does.
Really, I could not think of a single thing that people would complain about. It's very hard to do, like, a side-eye over a podcast.
There's so many white guy characters that are exactly like Rose, so
it's not, there's no doubt that it's like, it's racism, and it's, you know,
misogyny.
It's
and it's racialized,
kind of misogyny. It's racialized misogyny.
Yeah.
But and this book does have some very nice moments that are paid off in The Last Jedi, like establishing here that Falliers were Paige's favorite animal. It's like those were the animals that she wanted to see. And so this is almost why Rose is having such an extreme reaction to being on Canto Bight. I just really love the Tico sisters.
They are. A good companion to this is Jason Fry's Page Tico journal, Bomber Command. I just recently read it, and my library hasn't gotten in Rose's Resistance journal, but I imagine it's just so great. It's so great that, like, we get so much about their relationship in extended canon. I love it.
And what did we think about Amelin coming in like a badass at the end?
I loved it.
Yeah,
I love
I
that
just
Adeline
loved-
was like, I want you on my ship.
It's like, you saved her life, Amelin. I just loved how she came in, and it was very clear, like, this is Amelin when she's in command mode. It's just, yeah, and then just also seeing her through Rose's eyes, like Rose's first impression of Amelin as opposed to Poe's is very interesting too. I also just loved that moment where Leia and Amelin and Casca were all together planning, and I was like, hey, we have 3 women over 50 leading, being badass. That's really fucking cool. Like, I don't know, yeah, it was a really good book, so I definitely recommend that one. It's a quick read because it's YA, and like, I had a moment because I forgot that YA books do tend to be really fucking gruesome at times. Speaking of Hunger Games, that part where it was describing the prisoner drop-offs, like...
Oh yeah, into the acid seas.
But they would take them up into orbit without atmosphere control, so they would die there, and then drop them in the acid sea. And that actually, because I'm reading a book for my book club about Argentina in the 70s and their whole political upheaval, and there were political prisoners with sodium pentothal, but just enough to put them in a coma and not kill them. I don't know why. And then they would dump their bodies in the ocean for sharks to eat. And I was like, is that just like, did she know about this when she wrote this? Or is this just like, this parallel is just like, oh, let's think about really evil shit that people can do?
I'm not sure, but I vaguely think that she's written, like, her non-Star Wars stuff, she's written about, like, war stuff.
Oh, okay. That could have been inspired by that directly then. That was one of those things that made me just like, fuck.
There's an excerpt in Paige's journal describing the devastation of their planet.
The Automox system, or Haze Minor, and
yeah, that is like straight out of descriptions of American devastation of Vietnam.
Yeah, I think that parallel was...
They space napalmed.
Okay, I just looked it up. Elizabeth Wen has written a lot about World War II, like YA novels about World War II. And also she wrote one of the stories in From a Certain Point of View. Specifically, she wrote the one about the Imperial Navy trooper who was guarding Leia.
Oh.
It's called Change of Heart, which I remember very much enjoying. I gotta be honest, sometimes I think I might enjoy the YA novels more than like the full out novels. Maybe it has to do with the shortness of them, and I can get through them fairly quickly. But I don't feel like the quality is any less or that they're any simpler. I feel like basically the exact same books, just a little bit shorter.
No, I agree. I read a lot of YA just because that's where diversity of authors and protagonists tends to lie these days. Yeah, I totally agree. I enjoy YA a lot. So no shame here.
Mentioning diversity in authors, one thing I find very interesting is these 4 books that we're talking about today. Not a single one of them was written by a white man. I mean, granted, the 3 white women and an Asian man, but still, we talked about this on the last podcast with the diversity that they had with From a Certain Point of View. Lucasfilm, the numbers of white men writing for them are definitely less than back in the Legends days.
I think can celebrate and criticize them at the same time, and they don't cancel each other out.
Right. Thanks. Yeah. Disclaimer, obligatory there.
Well, it's hard times I like... It's probably exposure from certain sides of fandom is that, like, sometimes I feel when I'm, like, being positive about stuff, I have to be like, oh, I have to give, like, a slightly negative disclaimer, otherwise people will be like, you are a shill for Lucasfilm.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Or, like, the opposite, too. Oh, you are criticizing it. Well, do you hate it? You must hate it.
Yeah, well, I will celebrate that they do have a good amount of diversity in their writers for the books, but still criticize them about the fact that they haven't done anything about their directors yet.
The books, the story group,
Here we were going to talk about Phasma, but then we realized there is way too much stuff to talk about in the Phasma books. So we are putting a pin in that, and we will get back to that later this year. We will be doing a Phasma podcast, so keep an eye out for that. But for the last book we are going to talk about, which I think is probably not only the most different book in this podcast, but probably the most different book in the Star Wars Expanded Universe so far, and that's The Legends of Luke Skywalker by Ken Liu. And this was part of the Journey to the Last Jedi, and oh my god.
So I know it's been described as Canterbury Tales in space.
Oh,
Yeah.
I hadn't thought of that.
The very basic framework of this story is that there are these children on the way to Canto Bight, and they're telling each other stories about Luke Skywalker. And the resemblance to Luke Skywalker varies from story to story.
The first one is probably the most meta, wouldn't you guys say?
Oh, yeah.
I would agree with that, yes. Which the first story is basically a retelling of A New Hope, mostly, except it, does not resemble any of the characters from A New Hope.
Yeah, so that's the one with, oh god, what did she call Obi-Wan? Was it like the Kenobi gang or something?
Ben Kenobi gang.
Yeah, that one, it just killed me right away, like that. Because it was just such a good example of just like how far out things can get within even like a few years of the events.
Yeah.
Because you have Obi-Wan Kenobi was this legend like of the Clone War era, and then he's been reduced to the Kenobi gang, who are a group of charlatans who pretend that Luke is this famous Jedi.
But it's all parlor trick.
Yeah, there's Benny Wiseman Kenobi, Hansel Lightning Hands Shooter, Chewie Shaggy Baccarat, and Luke Babyface Clod Plotter.
In this story, there's basically this person telling it is like a conspiracy theorist, and they're like, look at the footage. So it's definitely like a meta reference to like the original edition and special edition version.
Right, yeah.
Of A New Hope. The way the destruction of Alderaan and the Death Star vary.
Appear different depending on what footage you look at. Yeah, and then
Yeah.
the stuff about Akbar being like a puppet, and that's why his mouth moves the way it did. Like all those things, it killed me. I was just like, it was a great introduction, I think, because it gets some of the stuff gets much more serious and mystical, but like that story was a great introduction to it. It's just like, okay, this is the kind of story, and I think it sets it up right away to be like, okay, remember, not all of the stuff that you're reading is true. I read reviews of this where people kind of think it's ridiculous, some of the things that it says that Luke did, and I think that sometimes people are missing the fact that these stories are supposed to be apocryphal. Like, we don't know what exactly is true from a sense of did this actually happen, but how much of it actually is in the spirit of who Luke is. Like the one that takes place on Jakku, I think that's more of an idea of this is the person that Luke Skywalker is, not so much this is a thing that actually happened.
Star Wars Explained, who I really love and I'm always shouting out, has talked about this book a lot and says that basically he believes that there's kernels of truth in every single story, but there's only one that he thinks actually happened, like the way that it's described, and it's the one which we will get to that is actually the person who's telling the story is like the person who is in the story, like it's the only first-hand account.
I agree. Is it Fishing in the Deluge? Because
Yes,
that one has the most like factual truth. There are like direct references to things he learned there in the movie and in like the visual diction and
Like spearfishing?
yeah, and in the visual dictionary for The Last Jedi.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, like, a lot of this is, like, our own modern idea of celebrity, and, like, how many, like, messed up stories have you heard about, celebrities doing, like, weird stuff? Like, Beyonce was never pregnant, or, Richard Gere and the gerbil story. Like, this is kind of the Galaxy Far, Far Away's equivalent of that, where there's, Luke Skywalker is a public figure who has not been seen in a very long time, so of course people are going to come up with these like really bizarre stories about him.
Or like even I listened to Karina Longworth's podcast, You Must Remember This.
Oh, it's a great
yeah,
podcast.
She gets into a lot of like, because she uses like, is, you know, like any good journalist, she uses multiple sources, and she talks a lot about when sources have conflicting stories about the same events, you know, because especially if you're looking at old Hollywood, so much of what was said about stars was completely made up. You know, but also like, you know, things get attributed to people that weren't actually attributed to them, or, you know, like you think about Marie Antoinette and the "let them eat cake" line, you know, something she probably never said.
All of the quotes Marilyn Monroe has supposedly said on the internet.
Yes, or Audrey Hepburn or William Shakespeare, depending on
depending on the day.
Yeah. So yeah, I think it is. It's definitely that sort of thing in action, but in the GFFA. But they kind of also have the misfortune of it being a much bigger place. So it's a lot easier for those things to get lost in the telling. And you kind of get the idea that, you know, storytelling is kind of probably still a big thing, especially when you're dealing with long space travel.
We've talked about the first story, but the second one is the Battle of Jakku, which is...
I'd like to talk about, because I think I remember there was this clickbait headline about how this story featured Luke Skywalker pulling Star Destroyers.
Yeah. Oh my god.
And that's not at all what happened. Turns out to be a story told by a soldier who was there. You know, whoever he told it to, he told them about it years later, and after having like defected from the Empire, but then been recaptured and tortured by them. So this is like, yeah, it's like a homeless war veteran on the street telling you a story.
He's suffering from PTSD, and it's one of those stories, it's like, I caught a fish this big.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, because we don't even know if Luke was at the Battle of Jakku.
People talked about with Wonder Woman, with the No Man's Land scene, like, you know, how could she have done that? And, you know, it wouldn't be like this big thing, like people wondering what the fuck happened. About apparently people talked about seeing like angels and goddesses on the battlefield. You see crazy shit in stressful situations, like because your mind is trying to make it make sense.
It's just really interesting from a narrative, like structural point of view, because he's remembering this an event that happened to him years ago, post-torture, and then at the time he was scared shitless. Like, so there's that layers.
And injured, right?
Yeah, he was scared shitless. Wasn't he also like suffering from dehydration
Yes.
and like
Yeah.
some other stuff?
The thing with Luke pulling the star is that like his ship is falling out of the sky, and there happens to be like a wanted hollow of Luke near him, and he's so scared and he's injured, and that like he almost fantasizes or hallucinated. The Luke Skywalker that he imagines, you know, at the beginning of the story is terrifying, like a terrifying enemy of the Empire. Whether Luke is actually there on the planet or not, like it's highly unlikely, but he transforms from that to like something that's a beacon of hope for this person over the course of this like very hallucinatory, beautiful story.
Well, you can almost think of it as like a companion to what actually happened in The Last Jedi, where Luke Skywalker stands in front of all of First Order machines, basically facing them down with a laser sword, as he said in the movie, but he's not actually there. It's kind of like this very beautiful bookend.
An echo, yeah.
People don't really want to comprehend because they just want to look at what's on the surface of things.
The reaction to this book is really funny. I've got to find this quotation. It's by one of the I guess the people on the Canterbury Trail. She talks about stories are important even if they're just legend, and like this is like clear to like you and me and stuff, but like it felt like very pointed.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the stories, like everybody who's telling the stories that they're telling, they get what they need from Luke Skywalker. It's why it's the legends of Luke Skywalker. This is not Luke Skywalker the man. This is the legend based off of, you know, everything that he did during the original trilogy. And so this as part of the journey to The Last Jedi, these are the legends that are being built up, and then The Last Jedi is going to knock them down and remind people that Luke Skywalker is just a man, and a very flawed man at that.
And it gives you an idea of some of the things that Rey might have heard of him, especially that Jakku story. That could be a story that Rey directly heard. Yeah, it could have been one that Rey actually heard some version of, so then her idea of Luke Skywalker would be like...
incredibly epic.
Yeah. So, which would, yeah.
Because she thought he was just a myth.
Yeah. That kind of gives insight into kind of her disappointment in finding out he's just a really depressed old man.
So I think we should leave Fishing in the Deluge to the last. But the next story is one I think Smalls will probably have some things to say about, because it's iDroid.
That's such a good story.
You guys, this was way before we met L3 when I read this book. You'll be unsurprised to know that I sobbed from beginning to end of this story.
Absolutely not surprised
at all. I think you guys would have been surprised if I didn't. Yeah, this story is amazing, and it really, I feel like as a story, it could almost transcend, I don't know, it could be taught by itself in a high school class. I mean, this whole book to be honest. But so anyway, iDroid is the person and the spaceship who tells it is, another droid, fittingly, and they're like, I heard it, from this droid, from another droid, and I'm telling it using, the words exactly as they were conveyed to me. So by the droid who was there. So the perspective point of view droid is a worker droid nicknamed Zeta. This is a feminine droid, and she's a load lifter, but she's a free droid. And so there's so much here. She's a free droid, and she works with her friends, but when she's not working construction, she makes art. She's a sculptor. I mean, there was the story, the red one in From a Certain Point of View is really great, but this one is just, she's built so richly as this person with an interior life and hobbies. She makes art, a droid who makes art, and she has a friend, so there's these social relationships between droid personages, and it's beautiful, and then they are captured by slavers. It's just chilling. It's kind of how, we talked when we discussed the last shot a couple months ago, we talked in the prologue about Lando's protocol droid being taken over.
Yeah, and that part of him still being...
his true self being there, but trapped inside.
And I compared it to the sunken place, which, same with her when she had the
people who capture them are sadistic, and they deliberately program them to be aware as they're doing things beyond their control. And they make her into an enforcer droid. So she's the one, she polices all these other droids as they're working in these harsh environments that are slowly killing them because of acidity or whatever. And she hates it, and it's just wearing her down as a person. And gosh,
when you described her as an enforcer, I just got this idea. I was I wonder if there's any parallel there that could be drawn between her and what was going on with Anakin Skywalker, as far as that light still being in him somewhere.
Yeah, well, it is, because there is that, because let me see, towards the end, in this, R2 gets captured, and then, so Luke is looking for him, and he's coming to rescue him, and he disguises himself as a protocol droid, and eventually, frees all the droids. Him being disguised as a protocol droid is, the only, relief in this bleak story, until, the happy ending. R2 says to him, because Zeta is the enforcer, so when he starts freeing people, she is programmed to fight back, and at some point, R2 says to him, don't hurt her, there's good in her still, I know it. R2 says this to Luke. It's very much a parallel.
This story is one of the ones that I think that this absolutely happened.
Yeah.
It's very much embellished upon.
Droids are not immune to embellishing stories.
At the end of the story, it does say that, he's at least partially, a great droid. And the thing is, that's actually true in canon, because he's got a droid hand.
It's interesting because they take that and make it a spiritual thing because it's from the perspective of a droid and it's a story that's been passed from droid to droid. The default perspective here is a non-organic one. And so that's a high compliment to be he's part droid.
He's got an invite to the picnic. That story really touched me as far, because I just really, You know, because Smalls really was the one who got me really thinking more about droids and their place in the Star Wars universe. So that was one of those stories where I read and I was like, oh my gosh, yes. It's like droids are people.
The prose is just beautiful in all these stories, really. Ken Liu is so impressive because all these stories are... This is a book that needed to be written by, like, one person, but who's capable of doing, like, many different voices. And they all do feel really distinct.
Yeah, I tend to forget that it's not an anthology, honestly.
So Luke is acting like a protocol droid, and he's clearly, like, kind of impersonating 3PO. He just says, like, for example, did you know that Senator Amidala of Naboo was an accomplished poet in her youth? And I just love that because I know because, you know, I love references to Padme. They're like crumbs. And so, like, I know that means, like, R2 talked about Padme to Luke.
Because we were talking about Ken Liu. Ken Liu also had a story from a certain point of view, as a lot of the novel writers did. And it was one that I liked quite a bit. It was The Sith of Data Work.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, he's so versatile. Like, because that story isn't like any of the stories in here, I don't think.
These are all so different. Like, the next one is kind of ridiculous.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And I don't even know if I can pronounce the title. It's The Tale of
Lugubrious Moat.
Oh god, this one. This is another one people complained about because they were like, I can't believe it, like, reduced that whole entire mission down to blah. And I was like, but it doesn't. Just because this little guy says this happened doesn't mean that that's what happened. Like,
It's a tall tale more than, like, any of the other ones. I remember just laughing through the whole thing because there's this little, like, flea-sized sentient alien being telling this story, and I just remember, you know, he lives on people's heads. Like, this guy lives on Salacious Crumb, and then he, you know, and supposedly, like, controls his mind, or tries to, and, like, it's like I just remember him talking about how great Leia's hair was, and how he would love to, like, and I was just like, me too, dude. Me too.
yeah.
Like, he's like, I want to live there in her, like, beautiful hair, like a bell tower. And I was like, yes, I would too.
Yeah, I liked the story just because it was so ridiculous. And it was just cool getting another perspective, like, supposed perspective on what happened. So it's like, you know, was this guy... this guy may have actually been there, but was he really controlling Luke whenever he beat the Rancor? You know, of course not. But it's a cool perspective because it's like, yeah, maybe he was riding around. Because else, how would he know all it? Like, how would he know these specific details if he wasn't at least there?
It reminds me of, like, a fairy tale or something.
Yeah, or it's like, you know, because there's that thread of truth and a lot of lies. So it's like, you know, to make the story more interesting, he's like, I did all this, of course, because I'm amazing. When really he was just like, oh my god, this is cool, this shit's happening. Like, different stuff is happening. Rather than the usual, like, yo, cool, somebody comes in, pisses off Jabba, they get fed to the Rancor, yay!
He made himself protagonist of the story, which of course you're going to do when you're, like, shooting the shit with people.
Yeah, yeah.
The next story, Big Inside, I mean, it's really hard to choose a favorite, but of these stories, iDroid, Fishing in the Delusion, Big Inside are probably, like, my favorites because I also cried during Big Inside.
This is the one inside the worm, right?
Yeah, it's the one set inside a giant space worm. Probably not the same one as the one that tried to eat the Millennium Falcon in Empire Strikes Back, but one of that same kind.
Yeah, it reminded me of, like, the non-Narnia stuff that C.S. Lewis wrote for some reason. I don't know, I only read those, like, once in middle school, but that was the feeling it gave me. It had this sort of, like, old sci-fi feel to it. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it was beautiful, and I also like this and the other with the Deluge one because they present more ancient other cultural ideas of the Force. What did they call it in this one?
They called it the Mist.
The Mist, yes, and it's the Tide in the other one.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's just this beautiful sequence where an ancient being talks to Luke about the Force, but the Mist. There are many great quotes about hope in new canon, and this includes one of them. The unnamed narrator of this story is a woman who's like a science grad student.
Yeah.
Which is lovely, and like an underfunded grad student biology student trying to get some fieldwork done, and she and Luke get eaten by the giant space worm, and they discover like basically a whole biome in there. Actually, multiple biomes. Probably more biomes in this Exogorth than on some planets.
One of my favorite bits of this is when they're talking about how Luke's gone off to find the Jedi, and she says, "Aren't the Jedi mostly a myth?" And Luke replies, "As much as new worlds waiting inside space slugs."
Yes.
I just love how mystically beautiful this is, and it's written from the perspective of like, you know, somebody in the sciences. It talks about that a little bit. Like, another quote is, I think Luke says it to her, it's like, the galaxy is knowable and that's what makes it wondrous. Like, it's very holistic, because it's not like, it's very holistic. Like, it approves, it, you know, like, having wonder and, like, questioning at the same time.
It's nice to have scientists appear in Star Wars, because definitely Star Wars is on the softer side of sci-fi.
This did such a good job of being very Star Wars from like this perspective, and it's great. There's a few other scholars in extended canon, but this is the first biologist, and I wish she had a name because I love her, but I love her perspective. But again, it's a legend, so it doesn't really like matter.
It's like the fanfic stories that are written about you.
Yeah, it is. That's a good way of putting it. The best self-insert Luke story I've ever read.
It's really cool, too, because it's like, it demonstrates, too, just being able to do whatever you want with this galaxy in your stories. You know, there's so much that you can do. You can create worlds inside of space worms.
It's very much like an affirmation of, like, you can make the Force work how you want, or that it's very flexible.
So we should probably move on to the last story, which is not the last story in the book. It's actually kind of in the middle. But I kept this for last because this one is probably fairly truthful. And that's Fishing in the Deluge.
Yeah, it seems like a first-hand account.
I think that's what we're supposed to imply, yeah.
Yeah, there is a lot of stuff that happens in it that Luke, like, brings out in The Last Jedi. And also, I think this is kind of, it looks like Luke.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
It's also, and it's one of the good examples of, you've got Luke learning about the Force not being your tool, but you being the Force's tool. He had kind of the same misconceptions at first that Rey did about what being a Jedi is and what the Force is.
Of the stories in this book, this portrays Luke the most humanly. Like, he makes mistakes and he, like, partially learns a lesson but doesn't completely learn it.
He's arrogant.
Anakin Skywalker's son.
Never. I mean, like, so many of the, like, I mean, it's all written by the same guy. It's wonderfully written. Like, you really get a sense of this world, even though it's just, like, this little short story. It's just, like, a little lesson that Luke learns. You know, we've talked before about, you know, what was Luke doing in all of these years between Return of the Jedi and The Last Jedi. This is the kind of stuff he was doing until he went into exile. Like, this is the shit that he was doing. He was going around to other planets and finding out about the Force. Like, sometimes he was finding, like, lost Jedi texts, and then sometimes he was learning about the Force from other people who might not call it the Force.
One of the first places he went after war was apparently Gatalenta, Amelin's homeworld, to learn about, like, their spiritual traditions. I'm looking for this quote about the wise woman, like the elder, says about the tide.
Is it the tide connects everything in the universe in a single web so that great tremors are felt instantly across all strands? We are not ignorant of the reality in the wider galaxy? That actually probably is not it.
No, that's a good one. I like all the quotes about that's not the one I was looking for, but that's still a good one. It's sort of this like prayer, I found it, that for every ebb there's a flow, for every flow there's an ebb. The full moon must wane, just as the new moon must wax. Happiness turns to sorrow, sorrow is reborn as hope. There is nothing constant but change in the tide, and I am change. That's beautiful. And it also, this is funny, it reminds me a little bit about this mantra that a young Darth Maul learned from Palpatine. It goes, far above, far below, we don't know where we'll fall. Far above, far below, what once was great is rendered small. I mean, because which is a Sith mantra. But, like, on the surface, both of those are pretty similar. That second one from Darth Maul isn't, like, inherently evil. Like, it's very much about, like, change comes, and the mighty are rendered small, and, you know, the small are lifted up, and that's the tide. And I just find that kind of interesting because the people of Luel talk about fleeing, like, a religious civil war, basically. Like, their ancestors fled that, like, 1,000 years before this. So that's just interesting in terms of, like we were talking earlier about possibilities about galactic history before the prequel trilogy, hence possibilities. But yeah, it's really interesting because, you know, the Elder is like, there are no sides to the tide. And they're not saying there's no good or evil. There's not this really, like, Luke has this really binary thinking.
Yeah. And he holds on to that.
He learns something, but he doesn't completely learn that because it's just so culturally foreign to him.
It takes a long time to let go. And then if you don't continually expose yourself to those kind of lessons, it can kind of, and especially if, like, his experiences seem to, like, reinforce the idea of this binarism.
Yes, because he learned about the Force and about being a Jedi in a setting of war. Like, Ahsoka went to war, but she also knew peace, and she knew learning about the Force not just in the midst of battle. I don't necessarily think that, like, talking about the dark side, I don't think there's any, like, wrong conception of the Force, but that each of them has its pitfalls, you know, the ways to be misinterpreted. Like, the dark and the light is not, like, a bad model, because everybody has to have a model, this spiritual thing, to, like, make some kind of sense of it to themselves and their context. Dave Filoni and George Lucas have talked about, like, the light side is unselfishness. You know, dark side, you know, the prevailing view is true. Like, the light is good, the dark is bad, but it's very, you can't only learn that. You can't make it so all or nothing.
It's nuanced.
Yeah. Dark versus light isn't necessarily bad, but it's more complicated than all or nothing. So it's not a bad model, but I think all or nothing, basically I speak of this because all or nothing thinking in terms of, like, my mental health recovery is, like, a huge thing for me that I have to constantly come back and, like, remind myself and ask myself, am I falling into all or nothing thinking? I mean, even in my own, like, religious struggles. And so I see that reflected a lot here, like, that none of, like, new canon has given us a lot of, like, different Force traditions and Force and models and, like, metaphors of what the Force are, and none of them are bad in and of themselves.
No, I think about, like, with Rey and the darkness on Ahch-To, you know, it showed her something that led to her being able to take a step towards being free of her past and what was holding her back. So that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. You know, and Luke was terrified of it, and, you know, and it could have led her to the kind of despair that could have opened her further to falling to the dark side, but it didn't, because, I mean, I don't know if it can just be because of who she is or because of the help that she got immediately following, you know, that, I don't know.
I just thought of the differences between Luke and the magic tree and Rey and her magic cave. I mean, there are a lot of them. Yoda and Obi-Wan were not telling him the truth. They did know the truth about his parents, and they didn't tell him the truth. They were lying by omission. And, like, Obi-Wan and Yoda are not, like, bad. They're not like evil people, but they did lie to Luke and try to get him to kill his own father without him knowing that. So they both see like, really horrifying things, or, like, really, like, things that, like, hurt them, that are, like, hurtful to them psychologically in their, like, caves, respective caves. But Rey comes out, and she has someone who's there who hasn't lied to her. And I know it's he's a villain, but
Star Wars is actually pretty good about having villains that tell the truth.
The ways they learn / accept them are really, really different.
So we should probably wrap up the Legends of Luke Skywalker now. I don't know. I think this is a book that everybody should read, even if, you know, well, Star Wars fans should read, because people who aren't Star Wars fans might get very, very confused.
Well, why are they listening to us anyway? So,
well, yeah, that is true. But any Star Wars fan that has not read any of the books should read this one, because it is an incredibly fascinating, I almost want to say character study, but I guess I will probably go with legend study.
Yeah.
You just can't take everything at face value. And that has been the major criticism that I've seen from people, is people taking stuff at face value. You know, like, oh, Luke pulling Star Destroyers down from the sky, and, a little flea thing actually did all of the work in Return of the Jedi. And no, you just have to accept that this maybe isn't real.
This is like a book of in-universe fairy tales.
Definitely, with everything that they did in The Last Jedi, disassembling the legend of Luke Skywalker and turning him back into a man, I think that this is an important book to build up that legend and just see just how prevalent it is in the galaxy, and to understand why Rey is in the position she is, where, she's gone from just being like this orphan on Jakku and having all of these expectations about Luke.
Oh, I want to say one last thing too. If you like space orphans, the framing. If you love space orphans and are looking to adopt, there are plenty of them in the framing device of this book, and they're all lovely little characters.
So, yeah, I think that brings us to the end of this roundtable. 3 books that I would recommend all 3 of them, because I think they are all really good. And I think I said this last time, they are just killing it with the expanded universe.
Legends of Luke is my top 3 Star Wars books of all time, though, for sure. Maybe even it might be even my very favorite. It's really hard to pick because they all do different things.
And definitely, if you want to know more about Ahsoka and you want to know more about the Tico sisters, check out Ahsoka and Cobalt Squadron. So, yeah, that's, I think, it. So, thank you guys for being on this roundtable.
Gladly.
And
thank you.
And we'll see you guys next month. So may the Force be with you.
Look like a farmer, but I'm a lover. Can't judge a book by looking out the book.
Thanks to April and Smalls for joining me on that roundtable. It is always fun to talk to them, and it is always fun to talk about the books. Sorry we weren't able to get to Phasma, but the conversation was just so big that we realized partway through that no, we weren't going to be able to put it in with these books. So look out later in the year for another Phasma podcast where we'll talk about the book and the comic and the character herself. Let us know how we did. Let us know anything else you would like to see from us. You can drop us a line on Tumblr at trashcompactorpodcast.tumblr.com, on Twitter at swtrashpodcast, on Facebook at Trash Compactor Podcast, via our website at trashcompactorpodcast.com, or good old-fashioned email, thetrashcompactorpodcast@gmail.com. Also, rate our show at iTunes and Stitcher, and check out our show merchandise on TeePublic and Redbubble. You can also check out our sister podcast, Drag Hags, a recap of RuPaul's Drag Race, and Return to the Hellmouth, rewatching Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Angel. See you next month, where we'll be talking about one of the more major ships in Star Wars fandom today, and may the Force be with you.